Ani, today is the annual remembrance of the residential school victims, survivors, and their families, which Sault College has always observed for a number of years. But it is the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Now, residential schools had a pervasive presence throughout Canada, and they're part of a shameful, racist, colonial policy to deal with Indigenous people that involve removing children from their families and their communities. And in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Report identified that at least 4,100 students had died attending residential schools from the 19th century to late 1990s. This number is rising significantly as school sites are being searched and finding mass graves and unmarked remains. According to Justice Murray Sinclair, the mortality rate at residential schools was between 10 and 15%, meaning the number of children who potentially died at residential schools could be as high as 25,000 children. Justice Murray said, miseducation of Indigenous people got us in this mess, and only true education will get us out of it. Now, I'm very reluctant to speak on this sensitive topic. As a non-Indigenous person, my voice should be silent. We have several Indigenous speakers today who will be speaking on this topic, including Carolyn Hepburn, our Dean of Indigenous Studies at Sault College. But one of the voices I wanted you to hear is too ill to attend today. That is the voice of Chief Joe Hare. Last week I visited him in his home in Chagink First Nation. He's an Indigenous Circle on Education member at Sault College, and he went to Garnier Boys Residential School for a number of years. And despite the mission of the school to destroy the, quote, Indian in the child, unquote, he's a resilient residential school survivor who kept his language and his culture, and he went on to become an outstanding Indigenous leader. Long-serving chief, 22 years as chief at Chagink First Nation, and then became Deputy Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, and eventually Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation. Because of his experiences at residential school, Chief Hare was determined that no other child should experience what he did, and he created the province's first band-operated school in 1980 in Chagink to replace the Indian Affairs School. Now virtually all First Nations in Ontario have band-operated schools, so there's reason for optimism. And I asked him, what should I say today? What can non-natives do to assist in the reconciliation? And he said to me, get Ontario to sign the Robinson-Huron Treaty Agreement. It's been 171 years since the treaty was signed, and it's time for Ontario to live up to its obligations. The federal government has signed off on it, the First Nations have signed off on it, and unfortunately, the Ontario government has taken them and appealed the decision to court. So what Chief Hare was really saying is, for reconciliation to occur, we need actions, not words. And he said we need to implement the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Well, trauma continues intergenerationally due to residential schools, but we have seen there's reason for optimism, but we must always recognize the tragedy of what went on in our residential schools and learn from this. Big witch.